Last minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning, Ryan. Is your Taylor?
And staying in front of the day isn't always
Hey,
as simple as 1,
What's
2,
up?
3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
What's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
Well, hello there, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, wellness coach, and well-being expert, Darlene Marshall. And before we launch all the way in today, I want to tell you a little bit about something that I've been working on. Because I know that there is a lot of people who maybe are struggling with some of the context that we're coping with day to day. And of course, the show is always oriented toward people who want to build well-being into their lifestyle, who buy into the idea that when we get to a place that we can thrive, we can pull other people up to thriving with us. And that, of course, we flourish together, right? Flourishing isn't something that we do alone. We do it as a collective. And this year, I've launched a new digital community that is aimed toward people who are looking to do that work, who need some tools, they need some practical support, but they also want the community. They want the together part. And maybe the social media stuff doesn't feel all that great for you and you're looking for an alternative. And that alternative, if all those things sound interesting to you, is called the Wellbeing Revolution. It is totally free. If you're watching this today on the live stream, we've got a free community workshop tonight on self-care, or you can sign up anytime, and that recording is going to be available until February 14th, until Valentine's Day, my little love letter to you all. So I hope that you check that out. If you want to check it out, you can head over to my website. It's www.darlene.coach. not .com, .coach. And there's a banner right there on the top for the Wellbeing Revolution. So I hope you check that out. All right, let's get to it. So over the last 6 months, if you are a fan of the show, if you listen to the show, you know, over this last 6 months, we've kind of been evolving a bit about the kinds of episodes that we invite on with us. Because one thing really struck me in 2024, pretty hard, which is the power of storytelling. I've always been such a linear thinker. I've always been so interested in the way that science gives us a way to qualify and to talk about our material reality. And when I first started Better Than Fine, I thought kind of like when I first became a trainer, like, oh, if I just give you the really good information, that'll be enough. And people will just like run off and use it and it'll change their lives and it'll be great. Well, it turns out that that's not actually how humans learn. And one of the most helpful tools in learning how to apply some of the concepts that science reveals to us about our material reality is hearing one another's stories. It's hearing the way that we go about our lives and our thinking evolves. And then we can, chime in with some of the science that gives us a language to describe our experience or help us understand it better. But if you think back over these last 6 months, we've had some really incredible stories shared with us. And I'm thinking of like Matt Howard and his journey through cancer and how tools of well-being help to unlock vulnerability for him. And now he's turned his cancer into a spark that is lighting movements toward greater well-being in others. I think of Ashley Teeter, who her story of how running set her free from the cult that she grew up in. Right? These are incredible stories that give us insight into maybe our own potential and the way that we can use these tools of fitness, of wellness, of well-being to open up greater insight into ourselves and how we live our lives so that, yes, we can get to a state of thriving and then share that with other people. So our guest today, I think, sits in this overlap of personal experience and expertise. And I'm really excited to have this conversation. I don't want to give too much away because I want him to share with you. But last fall, I had the opportunity to hear him speak a bit about his own journey. And he shared a few things that I literally have been chewing on for months. about how do we talk about this in an effective way. And I was so grateful when he said yes to coming on the show and sharing his story, because I think we are in a moment where people feel uncertain, regardless of your political affiliations. Like there's just a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen next and what's that going to mean for me and the people I love, and uncomfortable. Right? People are just uncomfortable. And I think that you'll find a lot in our guest's story about meaning making and how we meet these moments of tension. He is a hospital chaplain, an associate pastor, and a current U.S. Army chaplain candidate. David Griffith, welcome to Greater Than Fine. I'm so grateful that you agreed to come on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Darlene.
I want to get into your story without me coloring the audience too much more than I already have. But can you share with us a bit? So much of your life has been shaped by this one pillar event, and I just want you to let her rip and share with our listeners this really formative thing that happened so early in your life, and how it has shaped and framed you.
Sure. I'll do exactly as you put it. I'll let it rip as best as I can.
Thinking of Kayla.
So I am the surviving younger brother of Major Sam Griffith, United States Marine Corps. Sam was an F-18 pilot for the VMFA 533rd Hawk Squadron out of Beaufort, South Carolina. And then after he finished his duty tour as an aviator, he joined a Marine Reserve unit in West Palm Beach, Florida, called the 4th Anglico. And Sam served with Anglico as a forward air controller, which was unbeknownst to me at the time of his passing. I just thought my brother was some cool Marine Corps officer who was out about serving his nation, doing his thing. But after his passing, I found that Sam was actually the commanding officer of a detachment when he deployed to Afghanistan in 2011. And what his role was is he would serve with a platoon on foot, and they would go into combat and they would identify targets and coordinate with aircraft in the air to take out those targets. And so there were some aspects of his job that were safe, but primarily he was in the thick of it, as service members would say. And when he deployed to Iraq in 2003 as a pilot, he was still in danger, but being a pilot in the air, he communicated to our family that he was a lot safer than he would have been on the ground. And then so when he deployed to Iraq again in 2009, our worries increased. We were definitely praying for him and hoping that he would return home safe. And then again in 2011, when he deployed for his first time to Afghanistan, something just seemed a little off. I don't know how to explain it, but Sam was the type of guy who would smile and he would light up a room. He had a very personable personality. He loved his family, loved his Marines. And there were just certain things that he did prior to his deployment that just seemed a little off about this deployment. He made sure that his life insurance policy was in place. He made sure that money was squared away for his mortgage and for his wife and for his kids. His affairs were in order, so to speak. And so when he deployed to Afghanistan, I was 15 years old at the time. And I thought to myself, well, Sam's a superhero in my eyes. I mean, he's got plot armor, so to speak. And it was way out of my frame of mind that something that could happen to him would happen. And so I'll never forget it. My father and I, we were headed up to Pennsylvania to see my grandmother at the time. It was December 14th, this morning of December 14th, 2011. And we made it about half an hour away from our home when my father got a call from my older sister, Kelly. And she said, "Dad, there's Marines at the front door." And my dad slammed on the brakes and he pulled a U-turn and we probably flew through 3 or 4 red lights to get home as quickly as we could. And he didn't communicate to me what was going on or what had happened, because I'm not even sure he knew what exactly was happening. And so his response to the phone call, I mean, it was the first time I had ever seen my father cry in my life. I mean, my dad is sterner stuff, you know, he very well composed. And I was registering it in my head. Something was clearly wrong. Something was clearly wrong that will never be normal again. So what does this mean? And knowing that Sam was a pilot, I was looking out the windshield and I saw the airstream of an aircraft in the sky. And as soon as I saw that airstream, I knew right away that it was Sam. And as we were getting to the house, we passed the trees that were on our road to our my hometown home. And I said, we are okay so long as there's not a black van in the front yard. And as soon as we passed that tree line and I saw the black van on my driveway, my heart sank in a way that I didn't even think was humanly possible. And within 5 minutes, we were out of the truck. Within a minute after that, the Marines went up to my father and said, on behalf of the United States, we are sorry to inform you that your son was killed in Afghanistan this morning. And after that, it was a true blur. But within the next 48 hours, I mean, so many things happened so quickly. So many people showed up to our home. So many traveling plans were made, because my family ended up traveling to Dover, Delaware, where we would receive the remains of my older brother. And it was a whirlwind of grief is how I would put it. But the one thing that I recognize now that I didn't necessarily recognize when I was 15 was the level of shock. I don't think, based off of testimonies that I've heard from other people who've experienced grief, that they acknowledge the hit of shock, the initial hit of shock when they experience grief. And I'm starting to realize more and more that that's really what grief is in its adolescence, is just straight shock. And then everything that you experience thereafter is a side effect of the shock.
Yeah, that profound paradigm shift where, in psychology, we talk about your schema, right? The underlying set of beliefs and principles that it's like gravity. Mm-hmm. And suddenly there's no gravity, right? Suddenly the rules of how reality works are different. And I've obviously talked to other survivors. What I omitted from my introduction is that you and I met through the Travis Manion Foundation. And when I've talked to other families of the fallen survivors, they talk about that thing where, it's a possibility. Obviously, there's risk involved for any service person, and for any of us, like walking on the street, but it's not the same as someone who is deploying. And even were you aware when you were 15 as he was behaving kind of oddly for this deployment, or do you recognize that looking back that the vibes were different for this particular deployment? Were you aware of it at the time?
Not really. A lot of his behavior was communicated to me by my parents and by his wife, how they experienced the difference in his behavior. I mean, he was still, Chipper Sam, he was still loving. He was still present with us when he was with us. And there may have only been one time that I thought to myself it could happen. And it was actually the last day I saw him. My parents had taken me to Pennsylvania and my older sister Kelly to see our grandmother. And Sam lived in Virginia Beach at the time. And we didn't know if we were going to be able to see him before he deployed to Afghanistan. And so our last night at my grandmother's home, my dad got a call And he just smiled, and that was the end of the call. And I
Hmm.
looked at my dad and I said, "So when are we seeing Sam?" and he was tickled because he was like, how could you have possibly have known that was Sam? And I was like, because I know the smile you make when you talk to Sam. And so what Sam had devised was he wanted to drive across Virginia and meet us in the middle on our way home to North Carolina, to have lunch with us one last time before he deployed with his wife and my two nephews. And so we did. We met at an Applebee's. I couldn't tell you where at. It's just somewhere smack dab in the middle of Virginia. And we had a blast for an hour or two. We laughed over lunch. My nephews were really young at the time, so I was spending as much time with them as I could because I love them to death. And as we were getting ready to leave, we were saying our goodbyes, and I gave Sam probably the biggest hug of my life. And I looked at him and I said, "Just promise me you'll be safe." And he looked at me and he said, "I will." I mean, he was so calm about it. But I think that was the only time I asked Sam to make me a promise that it's one of those things in life that you can't promise. Like, you can't promise that you're going to be safe. It doesn't matter how hard you try. And he did the same thing with his oldest son, Chad. Chad had asked Sam not to die on his deployment. And Sam said, "I'm going to come home, buddy." I mean, we asked him so many things that he couldn't guarantee. And you can't help but have that pit at the bottom of your stomach. Like, what if? We hope not, but what if,
Yeah. And that no one can guarantee, right? I think that's one of the things that so many people are struggling with right now is the realization that you were introduced to early in life that there isn't certainty, and learning to cope with the fact that we don't get a say, I think is overwhelming to a lot of people. You're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm the host. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall. My guest is David Griffith, and we are talking about how do we make meaning from loss. And so, David, you had this experience early in life compared to when most people have this kind of loss. Certainly, there's people who have lost younger, but to lose your superhero at 15 is an intense disillusionment. And I think most people, understandably, that becomes the focal point, right? They're angry, they're resentful. But when I heard you speak in October, you said something that has deeply stuck with me. And while obviously this is still an incredible, painful loss that has reverberated through your life, what you'd said was that what you're doing now and who you're connecting with now and how you're working now wouldn't be were it not for this thing that had happened to you. So can you share with us where your life has taken you since this moment of profound grief, profound loss, the schema gets shattered, and then where does that lead you? Because what you do with it, I think, is a lot of meat and potatoes.
I think above all else, what I would try to communicate to those that are listening is that if you experience loss, give yourself permission to grieve. Nobody asks to experience something like that. Nobody wants to lose a loved one. No one I know. No one I've met. But what I have found is that when somebody experiences that big a loss, they don't know what to do with those emotions. One thing that I'm learning in the clinical pastoral education program I'm in right now is that there's no such thing as good or bad emotions. There are light and dark emotions. But truthfully, they're all good because they're worked into our DNA on purpose.
Yeah, they're all human.
So if you feel happy, it's a good emotion. If you feel angry, it's also a good emotion. There's a reason that you feel angry. Now, your anger or your sadness or your grief may be an unwanted emotion, But in order to get to that feeling of peace, that feeling of joy, that feeling of happiness that you may have once had, you have to be able to allow yourself to process those dark emotions to get there first. And it's really hard to learn that at 15.
Yeah.
When I had lost Sam, when my family had lost Sam, I didn't know what to do. And I think that's a very normal response, is, to start asking the questions. Like, how could such a bad thing happen to a good person? I hear that question all the time in my day job at the hospital. Like, why is God allowing this to happen to me? I'm a good person. Why is the universe allowing this to happen to me? They are all valid questions. But truthfully, I'm not God, and I do not have a good answer for that, aside from the fact that we live in a broken world. It's a very beautiful world, but it's a broken world. And we are susceptible to hardships just like anybody else. And it's how we respond to those hardships that will ultimately put us on the path ahead that we choose to walk down. And I think that's where, the realization that I came to after Sam had died. It took me quite a few months. One thing that I don't often tell people is that I actually suffered a traumatic brain injury about a month before Sam was killed. So while Sam, after Sam had passed away, I wasn't just suffering from the grief of my brother's loss. I was also suffering from severe migraines and poor mental health. And so I was put in a position where my grief for myself was almost amplified, more so than it may have been had I not suffered my injury prior to his death. And so for that first year of his loss, it was a lot of self-discovery, a lot of me trying to rework my identity of who I was. I knew that I wasn't happy in my grief, and I knew that I didn't want that grief to define me. I didn't want to just be a surviving brother, not because I didn't love my brother, not because I don't love Sam, but because I don't think Sam would have wanted that for me. I think Sam would have looked at me and said, I lived my story. Do what it takes to go live yours. Don't let this hold you back. And so I tried my best. And that's what I try to encourage other people to do who share similar testimonies with me.
You also, though, because I could hear where someone hearing that message of don't let this define you, moving completely away, right? I'm not going to talk about it. It's not going to be who I am. It's not going to become my identity. It's not going to this, it's not going to that. But I think you take that and you let it inform it instead of taking you over, if that makes sense. I'm trying to find the right words for the thing I want to say, because it's what you've done with it that I think is such a gift, not just to you, but to the people that you're in service of.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I said it in your intro, but I'm going to drive it home for the listener, is that you've gone on to become, you're currently an Army chaplain candidate. You're a hospital chaplain. You hold space for other people who are suffering in a state of potential loss or loss. And in some ways, I know from my own work as a space holder for other people with chronic illness, being able to say to them, I also have a chronic illness, the ability to then let that inform how I hold space is often a gift, where I've said before that having Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is one of the biggest gifts and superpowers of my life. Mm-hmm. That nothing that I do would happen if I didn't have this rare genetic condition that causes me to be in debilitating pain a good chunk of the time. But I wouldn't be able to do some of what I do if I didn't have it. Mm. And I hear an echo of that in you, where it wasn't just that, oh, go write your own story, but you allow your story to be informed by Sam in a way that I think empowers you. Mm. And I don't know how you want to speak to that, but I just want to reflect it to you that I see that from out here.
Well, I appreciate hearing that. One thing that the program that I'm in with the chaplaincy has taught me is that feedback is an incredible gift. How we receive feedback can be hit or miss at times. I think one of the most profound things I have ever heard since Sam's loss was something that my mentor and lead pastor actually taught me right when I started seminary back in 2020 or 2021, excuse me. He communicated to me that everyone is made on purpose for a purpose.
Mm.
And oftentimes we are spending our entire lives to figure out what that purpose is. But so long as we keep trying, so long as we keep pushing forward, so long as we identify where our strength comes from and we hold on to that truth, it'll get us where we're supposed to go. And Sam, I really appreciated the fact that you invited me to come on to the show, especially after our conversation, because one thing that I communicated when I saw you last in Houston was I'll never be thankful for Sam's loss, but I will eternally be grateful for the people that I have met and the opportunities that I have experienced since his loss that I otherwise may not have had afforded to me had he not made the ultimate sacrifice. It's really incredible what human beings are capable of doing when they have shared experience and they can learn how to tap into empathy as, based off of our language here today, as a superpower, and use it to help other people in their journeys. It's not easy. But one thing that I would communicate to those that are listening today is that nobody is more qualified to help somebody who is going through a hard time in life than somebody who's been through a hard time in life and came out the other side thinking to themselves, wow, that really sucked, and I hope to never go through it again. But it's made me who I am, so let me do something with this. And based off of, the testimonies that I've heard and the individuals that I've met, Ryan Mannion, Amy Looney, Bonnie Carroll, all these amazing individuals, they suffered ungodly loss and trauma. And in probably their darkest, deepest valley that they have ever walked through, they thought to themselves, I don't want to stay here. I know there's a summit ahead. And so they decided to climb the valley. And I tell folks all the time, don't convince yourself that life is a mountain. It's not. Life is not a mountain. It's not this thing where you start at the bottom and you work your way up to the summit, and then you get to the summit and it's great, right? Life is filled with mountain ranges. There are going to be times where you are in the valley and you're going to be expected to climb that mountain. And you're going to get to the top of that summit and you're going to look out and you're going to think, wow, that was worth it. This is beautiful. This view is beautiful. But there's going to come a time in your life where you may have to face another valley. You're going to be expected to climb down that mountain to make it to a higher peak. Just keep going.
Incredible layers of wisdom. And I want to circle back. But for the listener, you're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. My name is Darlene Marshall. I'm your host. My guest is David Griffith, and we're talking about how we make meaning out of our biggest challenges. And a moment ago, you talked about trauma. And I feel like trauma is something that is very buzzy these last few years. Everybody's suddenly a trauma expert. But the thing that I so often don't hear discussed, that I think you are such a paragon of, which is partly why I'm so grateful for you for being willing to have this conversation and to be so open with us about it, is post-traumatic growth. And, you mentioned Ryan, you mentioned Amy. For the listener, these are people that we know through Travis Manion Foundation who lost their loved ones in service and have used it to create incredible mission and purpose. And I always love it when positive psychology space and other disciplines have similar resonance in the messaging. And you talked about your instructor in school talking about your strengths and finding purpose and seeking purpose. And recently I heard Seligman talk about, the most impactful, simple thing that anyone could do in order to improve well-being is to find someone who needs help and to help them. And I keep thinking about that, because the other thing everybody wants to talk about right now is purpose, right? It's like trauma and purpose. Everybody wants to talk about resilience, trauma, and purpose. I don't think that purpose is something that we seek out. I think purpose is when we use our strengths to help the people around us in the ways that we are empowered to do. And then in that way, purpose finds us. And I think you, again, are such a good example of the way that purpose found you. You had this incredibly difficult thing happen to you early in your life. And here you are using it as a catapult for your own growth, and then to turn back around and say, hey, I'm climbing this mountain. Here is a path. It doesn't have to be the only path, but if you need some help finding a path, I have climbed that mountain, and inviting people to follow you. And I think one of the reasons this is also important, I swear I'm making a point here. One of the reasons I think this is also important is that in that dark valley, there are people who get lost and they believe that there is no longer a mountain. They believe that the difficult emotions don't have a message for them. There is no, or that they don't, what I think is actually worse, they don't think they have a right to joy again, right? If my battle buddies are gone, or my partner, my child is gone, who am I to feel joy again? And I don't know if you wanted to speak to any of that, but I think part of the growth is the decision to use it instead of to let it use you.
That's profound.
Mic drop, Dave. Mic drop.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. One thing, so Darlene, you know this about me, so I might as well verbally communicate it so that others can understand me a little bit better, is that at Travis Manion Foundation, we take the VIA Strength Survey, which tells us what our top character strengths are. And mine are love, kindness, and spirituality. And so I want to, if you're okay with that, I would like to invite that into the conversation, because
we like the woo woo.
it's what makes me who I am.
Yes.
It's my spirituality.
I want you as who you are. We're not shying away from it. Don't worry.
And part of my faith, which is Christianity, is the community aspect. I believe at the core of who we are designed to be in community with one another. I believe that we were created to be in community. That also connects with loss and grief. So what is the first thing a human being does when they experience loss or trauma?
Turn inward.
They turn inward and they run away. They completely try to cut themselves off from everybody around them, because they're like, something is happening or something has happened, and I'm trying to process this. And until I can feel normal again, I need to be left alone.
Yeah, this hurts. Turn in. Protect.
Exactly. I am not saying that there is wrong in that. You know, I'm an introvert. I'm a high functioning introvert, but I'm an introvert. And so I value time away. I value being able to recharge and, you know, have that time to myself. But I don't believe I need to be by myself all the time. And even when Sam had died, I spent a lot of time by myself. You know, I needed that time to think and process, and there is healing in that. But at some point, you got to go back out. You got to be able to talk to people. You got to be able to process these things with other people. And I think that's what's so wonderful about the surviving family member community connected to the military, is that it is truly a community of people where you don't have to hide what you've been through. Regardless of how you lost your loved one, there are people there that can connect with you in a way that no one else can. And there is nothing worse, in my opinion, and I might be biased here, but there is nothing worse than experiencing something that I perceive as negative and thinking to myself, nobody understands me.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to listen to me. Nobody wants to see me. Because I think that those lies are what catapult us into isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And so finding a way to maneuver that labyrinth of grief and shock and sadness and saying, okay, this happened. I need to give myself the grace, the self-grace to process this. But at some point, I need to go back out. You were talking about battle buddies who lose comrades. They need to, sometimes people need permission to talk. Sometimes people need permission to grieve. It's not because they don't have the freedom to talk or the freedom to grieve. It's because they feel like they need to hear the verbal permission to be able to do those things. And they'll give you cues. They'll give you signs. You know, my favorite one is, hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm good.
I'm fine, which is why this show is called Better Than Fine, because that was my line.
Yeah.
I'm fine.
So, you know, between, you know, pastoring at my church, working at the hospital, serving soldiers, I hear that a lot.
Yeah.
I hear that more times than I can count. And there's something really special about pulling out that caveat from your pocket and saying, okay, how are you really doing though?
Yeah.
That's the permission piece. That's the invite. That's where that door can swing wide open. We have to prepare our hearts and ourselves to be willing to sit down and listen once we ask that question to that person's story. Because we could very well be the only person who has invited them to share that story.
And that invitation is so essential. And I think I'm very fond of saying humans are pack animals. My shorthand for everything you said about we were made this way is humans are pack animals. And the invitation, I think, is so often discounted. The people, you know, when I say find people you help and help them, find people who need help and help them, it's being so often communicated to us by behavior that is often normalized, right? I'm fine. I'm good. And what's underneath that is, I don't want to be a burden, or you're not going to understand anyway. You don't actually care. And just that little nudge, the person who is struggling to regulate, the person who is struggling to communicate, being a space holder, being someone who creates the invitation for a real conversation, that is helping. And I think it's a form of helping that is devalued in our culture. You know, emotional work is, again, it's becoming more buzzy. People want to talk about it more, but the real work is in what you're describing, right? Being willing to just listen and hold the space and validate someone else's hurt feelings and reflect back to them what you're hearing. And they're such foundational emotional skills that I think a lot of people take them for granted, but it's a lot of what people need right now.
Absolutely. I would only add one thing to that.
Yeah.
Empowerment.
Say more.
Empowerment is so crucial to the grief journey. One of my catchphrases as a chaplain is that grief is not linear. You
No.
are not going to experience grief and it's just going to be the straight path forward. It will not. You are going to weave. There's going to be times where you're going to be on that roller coaster and you're going to feel like you're coming off the rail. You will recenter yourself. As long as you give yourself permission to, and you keep pushing ahead, you will recenter yourself. But I think empowerment is so crucial. And when I think of empowerment, I think of a couple of names. I have been blessed to have a number of mentors throughout my life who have kept me centered on that non-linear path of grief. The first one that comes to mind is Lieutenant Colonel John Fulton, who is in the United States Marine Corps. He was actually one of my instructors at Penn State when I was going through ROTC. And I was in another valley at the time that I met him. I had suffered another loss. I had gone through a pretty bad breakup at the time. My parents were also splitting up. And I had adopted a victim mentality. I had identified myself with what had happened to me. And John recognized it. And he recognized it in how late I was showing up to PT in the morning. He recognized it in my failing grades. And he recognized it in just my demeanor. He knew my backstory. He knew about Sam. He knew what I was there for. He knew that there was something in me that made me want to be there, right? You're made on purpose for a purpose. He looked at me one day after I was trying to communicate to him that I was sad. And he looked at me and he said, "Griffith, I want to tell you something. A little heart can go a long way in the Marine Corps." And I didn't understand that at the time. I was like, okay, great. Anyway, back to my grief, right? Well, I failed out of college my first semester. And don't worry, I went back.
I ain't worried.
It took a lot of me getting my act together. But when
Sure.
I failed out, I went home and I read this book by Nathaniel Fick called One Bullet Away. He talks about his experience at OCS and how he had this moment of shock while he was at officer candidate school for the Marines. And his sergeant instructor looked at him and he said, "Fick, a little heart can go a long way." And it's like a light bulb went off in my head, right? And what I found is that John was trying to empower me in that moment. Like, hey, yes, you experienced this, but this isn't who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Keep pushing ahead. Have the heart to keep pushing ahead. And so, I've adopted that as my life mantra. A little heart can go a long way in life. And I mean, it has gotten me through some pretty amazing things. I failed, or no, I did not fail. Let me reiterate this. I got medically disqualified from the Marine Corps. And that shattered me as a human being. And, as I talked about, spirituality is a huge part of my life. I was really mad at God during that season of my life. And I blamed him for him allowing me to do something and then taking it away. Unbeknownst to me, he was trying to get me where I needed to be. I didn't see that at the time. I was extremely stubborn. In some cases, I still am. I ended up joining the Army, and I was able to get a waiver for what I was disqualified for by the Marine Corps. And I struggled in Army ROTC. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do in the Army. I wanted to fly jets just like Sam did in the Marine Corps and in the Army. Aviation seemed cool, but I was not attracted to helicopters. I wanted to be a jet pilot. Not saying they're not cool. They're amazing. I could not do their job.
Say, Matt Howard might argue with you.
And so I was in my junior year, and I was recovering from this valley season. I was working my way to another summit, and I met this chaplain named Lieutenant Colonel Gramling. And he was just there to visit our ROTC battalion, and my instructor got me connected with him. He said, hey, we've got a surviving brother who's on his way to becoming an officer, and he's super spiritual. Why don't y'all go to lunch? So we went to lunch, and I shared him a lot of the testimony that I've shared with you today. And he just sat there and smiled at me. And I said, okay, what's going on here? And I finally, when I had finished sharing my piece, he looked at me and he said, David, you've communicated to me a lot that you feel lost right now. Did you ever think that what you have gone through was God's way of molding you into the man that he needs you to be that for somebody else? And I said, what do you mean, sir? He was like, you should really consider being a chaplain. And I was like, what? You have no idea who I am. You have no idea what I've done, what I've been through. I'm the least qualified person to be a chaplain, let alone a pastor. And he had shared this quote by C.S. Lewis where he said, God typically sets up ordinary people for extraordinary destinies. And, that's what I leave for those that are listening today. Don't discount yourself. Don't discount your experiences, because you may be actively being set up to do for others, to offer a service to others that you may have needed at some point in your grief journey or throughout your loss. So long story short, I went back to basic training at the end of my junior year. We call it advanced camp. I did okay in garrison. I failed miserably at tactics at advanced camp, and came back my senior year, threw my packet in for chaplain candidacy. And it's like all these doors started flying open. It was the first time in my life that I had gotten continuous yeses back to back. And I was like, wow, there might be something here. And it got me where I needed to be. And I can't even begin to express to you the joy that I get sitting with people in the midst of whatever it is that they're going through, and just saying, hey, I'm here, and I love you, and I see you, and I'm not going anywhere. Yeah. I'm right here with you.
And what I hear in that is, calling is one thing, but we have to be willing to answer, right? You got to pick up the phone. And I hear the moment of calling, but I also hear your willingness to say, okay, yeah, let's give this a shot. And then the doors start flying open and the wheels get greased and away we go. And I want to thank you so much, because the other thing I think when it comes to permission is a willingness to share and to be vulnerable. And there are so many things about yourself and your story, and also sharing Sam with us, that you've been so generous in that vulnerability on the show today. And I appreciate you so very much for all of that. And I know you are a chaplain candidate, so I am going to send you off with all of the wishes of everyone listening and myself, that continue to be a rich path for you and for everyone that you serve.
Thank you, Darlene, very much. Sending you a lot of love.
Always. And thank you. Thanks for being on the show, David. It's good to see you.
You too.
And of course, if you have any feedback on this or any episode of Better Than Fine, I hope that you will reach out. You can send me an email. It is info@darlene.coach. My Instagram is also darlene.coach. I'm on LinkedIn, and my website is, wait for it, darlene.coach. If you're a fan of the show, I hope that you've already subscribed. But if you haven't, you're going to want to do that right now. Of course, like, comment, share, leave us a review, preferably as many stars as on whatever platform you're on, because that does help the algorithm to help other people to find us. Thank you so much. Take good care of yourselves and be well. Bye.